I don't want to touch anything on the computer here. Okay, good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the 6th season of Artwork, a series in which we have innovative artists come to Lang to talk about their artistic process. Is this okay? I'm Bonnie Marranca, professor of theater at Lang, and also the curator of this series. This evening, our special guest is the performance artist and writer Ernesto Pujol, who describes himself as a social choreographer. His works are site-specific, but that does not only refer to the sense of space, but to the larger demands of looking, being aware, gaining insight. For many years, Pujol has been preparing durational works in cities and rural landscapes with large groups of artists and local people, or by himself. In Honolulu, he created Speaking in Silence, whose performers were scattered in several sites around Honolulu, from sunrise to sunset. In Awaiting, a silent group performed on the steps of the Utah State Capitol for 12 hours. In Farmer's Dream, silent performers in Kansas, dressed in white, sat across a large wooden table all through the night. In Boston, he made a pilgrimage through the city. The journey is what's important, not the destination. And getting there requires a commitment to a set of values in which the artist is willing to lead performers through a series of esoteric questions underpinning his thought process. What happens when you use love to generate your action in the world? In what way can vulnerability be a methodology? What is the sound of silence? These are all his questions. The most important unit in his work is silence, which is often a walking meditation. I am a walker by profession. I walk alone. I lead walks. I watch walkers walking, Pujol says about himself. Where will it take me? I think he must be asking himself, dressed in his white robe of wonder. What's important are only the essential things, the cultivation of no mind, emptying your thoughts of the excess baggage, and then filling up with consciousness. This is his zen of performance art. He opens himself up to the many delights of the world, the sound of breathing, birdsong, awakening sun, moving water. For Pujol, environmentalism will become the new spirituality in art, replacing the cynical pollution of the art market. He devotes himself to a new vision of arts training that will educate the student, not institutionalize her. What Pujol offers in his writings and performance is a manual for living. Still, it is of this world, not solely interior. In one of his essays, he writes, "There is no democracy without art. The American democratic experiment needs critical, creative artists so as to ensure the sustainability of democracy in an equally diverse, economically impoverished society." End quote. Pujol, born in Cuba, growing up in Puerto Rico, and coming to the US, where he studied and became an artist, is acutely aware of the pride and prejudices of Americans. The artist as citizen is one of his performance rules. These are not the only rules Pujol has known. As a young man, he spent several years in a monastery as a Trappist monk, that is, one who is silent, cloistered. He followed the rules of Saint Benedict, established in the 6th century. Eventually, coming out of the monastery, he brought his rigorous, disciplined body to the practice of performance and to his need for ethical principles, purity of the soul, gratitude, transcendence. His body became a keeper of knowledge, his heart a spiritual guide. Together, these things would bring him the freedom of letting go into the flow of life all around him. In his perspective, quote, "Our education should be about sustaining the not knowing," end quote. This via negativa would define the paths of his many pilgrimages. Ernesto Pujol has turned the received art vocabularies inside out, offering his own language in its place. By putting one foot in front of the other, day by day, he walks toward a place, but never arrives. The pleasure is purely in the walking and wanting. and that's just the way he likes it. In an effort to get him to reveal the secrets of the universe, I hope you will join me in welcoming Ernesto Pujol as our guest this evening.
Thank you. That was really generous and really lovely. And I have to say, in a very rudimentary way, you get it. Hardly anyone does. And you mentioned the word love, which is like overwhelming. And that's great. I was just having these images playing, and they were 23 performers during 23 mornings in Maine, and basically it was a kind of assignment where they were asked to individually, nobody watching, get up and go to this shed in the woods and put on this gardener's robe from the 1930s, and they could wear nothing or anything underneath, and then go out into a field. I'm going to step away from the microphone. And what you're seeing then is walking a circle counterclockwise and backwards. This is all they're doing. And of course, they have a center that you can't see because it's very hard to walk a circle without a center. Otherwise, you meander. And so they had a center, which was a stone, a pebble, that they would, arrive to the meadow, place anywhere they wanted, and then, take a distance from it, and then begin to walk, keeping it out of the corner of their eye. And that helped them maintain the circles. Some people were remarkable. Some people walked very tight little circles like a donut. Some people walked incredibly wide circles. And they were very sleepy, and it was for them. And I went in for the first 5 minutes and took some photographs at a distance. They never saw me, and then I left them because it really belonged to them. It was a piece for them, by them, in the training of performers. As Bonnie said, I'm interested in a kind of presence, but it's not necessarily anthropomorphic. It's not about me and my presence, or you as your presence as a performer. It may be the presence of something that we have stopped looking at, seeing, perceiving, experiencing, because it is so there, and we have seen it so often that it is now invisible. The irony of that. And so this was an intervention in Portland, Maine, where you have this spectacular harbor, which, when you live by the harbor, you don't see the harbor after a while. Like when you live by a river, you don't see the river after a while. And some foolish man or woman has to come and sit by the river and say, here, I'm selling you water. And you will say, why are you selling me water? I can get it myself from the river. And you see it again. There it is. The river is there. But until I did something foolish, you had not seen the river for a while. And so we made an intervention on this beautiful hill that overlooks the harbor. And simply had a number of performers from 8 in the morning till 12 noon be there, kind of establish a gaze. And then all these people that were running to work, jogging, really doing anything but looking, stopped, slowed down, and looked with us. And so the performance was multiplied times 2 and times 5 and times 10. And it was a very simple piece. And then the performers walked away in the same silence And the walking away was very sad. Suddenly, it was amazing what being there with a kind of no mind, empty mind, or perhaps meditating. I do not know what went through everybody's mind, if they had one. But once establishing that presence, suddenly it was incredible how later they said how tearing it was to take themselves away from there. So that was outside, establishing a kind of presence, and this is inside. This was a piece commissioned by the Chicago Cultural Center when they began their new performance series in 2006-07, and I was very honored to be the first performer to open this. And the center used to be the old Library of Chicago, and one of its rooms is this very grand room, which is the memorial to the Grand Army of the Republic, which was constructed with mosaics and an amazing Tiffany window by the widows and orphans of the American Civil War. And during the day, it's very brightly lit by light that comes through the dome, if you will. And then at night, the floor becomes a kind of checkerboard and becomes alive. And so it was an architecture kind of ready for the taking. Certainly if you're a performance artist, you're always looking for the hints and the signs and the mathematics and the geometries of architecture if you work in the public sphere. Both the ones that were planned and the ones that happened organically, because we human beings have a way of, ignoring the paths that we're supposed to walk according to instruction, and so lines on the floor, and so we basically did a piece, and this was 2007. With the whole conflict in the Middle East really very much in our minds, and that whole environment that had been left behind by a certain administration that you couldn't question the war. It was unpatriotic. You couldn't mourn. You didn't see the people coming back in the bags, the fallen soldiers. You didn't see the civilians over there. And so we staged a kind of mourning. We took the excuse of the American Civil War. We are a country formed by war. We're always at war, declared and undeclared. And so we mourned. We joined the life of the building from 9 in the morning till 9 in the evening. At 9 in the morning, we appeared as the pawns, as soldiers can be, as civilians can be, of an architecture, and we stood in these rectangles, gridded rectangles of light, and we took turns. There were, I believe, 16 of us. I think there were only 8 rectangles. I'm totally dyslexic, so remembering numbers is very hard. And but we stood in on these rectangles, and of course, we were in white. The rectangle was flooding light like a beam upwards, so we were lit, and we took turns. There was a series, a kind of secret menu of performative gestures, and as we needed, because it was, 10, 12 hours, we would enter or exit through this door to take a break. It was not an endurance piece, but it was a piece about this sustained presence. And what we were manifesting this time was not some invisible landscape, but, perhaps an emotional human landscape, and the need to mourn what we were both suffering and what we were also triggering in the world. And then in the end, the performers disappeared one by one, and I was the last one to go, holding the space for the rest. A similar piece, but now looking beyond was a piece called Sophia. This was a commission of Bezalel, the national art school in Israel. I was very interested. I was invited twice to teach, and as contested as that whole space is, and to step into the tension between Israelis and Palestinians, I really believe in the messiness of it all, and I really do not believe, I believe in ethics, but not in purity, which is a funny thing to say. And so I stepped into this space, this very contested space, and I was invited simply to do a piece about the city of Tel Aviv, which is a secular space within what you may call a religious state. And so I organized a group of Israeli, European, and North American performers, and collaborating with an Israeli light artist and an Israeli sound artist. We found this building that was the man auditorium of the Israeli Philharmonic, which and the Israeli Philharmonic is very connected to the founding of the Israeli state. The day it's declared, the Israeli Philharmonic comes out and plays the national anthem, the new national anthem, if you will. And so it's an interesting combination of music and politics, if you will. And so this building was being contested to be demolished, and they wanted to build a kind of Frank Gehry sort of enormous glass animal. And yet Tel Aviv has been declared by UNESCO to be one of the cities that really holds one of the finest examples of modernist architecture. So I staged a kind of group of sentinels, men and women in Sufi, in Islamic skirts, and the kind of little vest, but without the shirt and without the hat, that a Sufi dervish, taking from Islamic mysticism would wear. And so I had us walk an entire night the plaza of this building in this kind of downtown Tel Aviv, where it's kind of the Lincoln Center of the city, and yet it borders on a very poor area right behind with a lot of prostitution and new immigrants, many of them from Africa and so on, workers. And so we spent a night, and this is 3 in the morning. We spent, when everyone has gone away and the performance belonged to us and to the city, we spent the morning looking at the city, and all night looking at the city as a kind of sentinel, and without judgment, just looking. And then we had this beautiful light show that Jan Tichy did of these very ominous, blue moons going around the building. And then we had the sounds of the Philharmonic and the city, other parts of the city that would not sound here, being played back, so that a siren, came by, and and our DJ played a sound, and there was this, the city and the building spoke to each other. It was very interesting. Afterwards, Ruti Doctor, who is an independent art critic, gave us a really beautiful comment by way of a review, saying that it was one of the few times where an American artist had come in not to take the side of, the Jews or the Palestinians, but just to be there and witness to something. And that was very rewarding. That was exactly what we wanted to do, to experience something without judgment, and yet to also show our ethics and our empathy. And then in the morning, in the morning we, that froze. Let's see. We simply disappeared. As the morning came, we came out to the balconies for the last time, and then walked away. And then a year later, there was a biennial in the city. I'm going to fast forward these a little bit. And so this is morning now, after sunrise. And we go back into the city, into the building that kind of swallows us and just disappear into its shadows. And then a year later, all this documentation was taken up by Israeli artists who really embraced the piece, and during a biennial, projected throughout the city of Tel Aviv. So the piece had a second life as a kind of shadow, as a kind of ghost throughout the city, and throughout some of the poorer working class areas. Suddenly we were walking. There were all these videos and photographs being projected on storefronts and so on of these sentinels that were watching. And then I love cities, and I love to do portraits of cities. I like that whole tradition that came and went in the early days of photography, where an itinerant photographer would go out west and with a tripod and a very big, heavy camera, and travel the country and find the homesteader, out in Kansas or Arkansas, the Dakotas, and set up the camera, and that whole family that had gotten there, staked a claim, their 40 acres or however many, and undone the wagon into the first one-room house into maybe a hill if the land was hilly enough. They came out in their Sunday best plus their donkey and so on, and posed. And he or she took a photograph that made them stand still. If you know about early photography, they had to stand still for a very long time, because that's the way it worked. And so that kind of portraiture that in fact is very coded, because those people came out in their Sunday best and posed. And so you have to read it in a certain way. It was not them farming. It was not them drunk or angry or sad or mourning. It was just them showing you their best. That kind of encoded portraiture is very interesting to me. And so this was a project of the NEA. And it became known as Speaking in Silence. And basically, it's a portrait of let's say, the city of Honolulu, where 19 performers dressed in red, which was the national color of the nation of Hawaii before U.S. planters staged a coup and dethroned the last queen of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, a very good friend of Queen Victoria. The Hawaiian monarchy being very much structured and fashioned and built as the British monarchy. And so we had 19 performers in 12 historically significant sites. This is the Botanic Garden that has preserved some of the native indigenous flora of Hawaii, of the islands. And so we had them dispersed in 12 sites, alone or in pairs. And they each, this is one of the colonial buildings, now the National Museum of Art. We had a whole day from sunrise to sunset where they were walking the city, and you were given a map where you could find them, the neighborhoods where you could find them. And they were walking those neighborhoods, walking those buildings, walking those areas. They had the option as a kind of performative menu to be silent or to read if they felt like reading. And what they had was a kind of compendium of thousands and thousands of words in the Hawaiian language, in the native indigenous Hawaiian language, which the native people fight very hard for its continuity as part of one of the foundations of their identity. And so they had these lists of words, and if they were moved by weather, sun, breeze, people, emotion, what have you, this is the Carnegie Library, they could open it at random or look for a word, because they were alphabetical, and read it in Hawaiian, and then translate it into English as a kind of entry point into the landscape and into the people. And it was remarkable because as we've heard, to the point of it being a cliche, that in Alaska there are so many words for snow. We have one word for snow, but there may be 30 words for snow. There were so many words for one or another thing in Hawaiian that it was really lovely. This was in Chinatown, Honolulu. And this was, a regular day in the life of the city. And nobody was trying to be a monk or a nun or a ghost. It was simply a walk and a kind of consideration to recognize, a kind of recognition. I think one of the things that happens with these projects is that they turn you into a scholar. They take 2 and 3 years to produce. This is the palace of the kings and queens of Hawaii, and the only palace in the continent, in the United States, actually. And the woman who was matched to this place had been a political activist, a native political activist, who had chained herself to these railings, trying to recover the real estate for the native people, and been arrested and imprisoned. And she was the performer, matched to the place, and she spent 12 hours there on stairs that she had previously been forbidden from trespassing, and plus the balcony. It was really moving to see her there, and for everyone who saw her. And then in the gardens of the palace, we had a second performer in the bandstand, and the 2 women from the main structure to the garden had this wonderful, at times, conversation of words that were uttered back and forth. But again, and this is the missionary museum of the first missionaries from Boston that came to the islands. It looks like Provincetown in the middle of the Pacific. And this is one of the oldest cemeteries in the island. But these projects, throw anyone who takes them on into a kind of scholarship, into a kind of public scholarship where there's no way to do this as a tourist. You have to really, immediately when you get commissioned to do these, take on the history, the literature, the myths, everything of the place, the environment, the ecology of a place. This is the memorial to the war in the Pacific. It used to be a native burial ground, but the missionaries took it over, turned it into a Christian cemetery, and then the military took it over and turned it into a military cemetery and monument. And at the top is the figure of Columbia as a kind of goddess of wrath. And it's very interesting to have placed her there. Something very archetypal happened when that happened because, one of the greatest goddesses of Hawaii, of course, is the goddess of the volcano. And when you see this heraldic figure, it's almost like she is performing something that she was not supposed to perform. I'm sorry, but for some reason the conversion, the computer freezes, and so I have to there we go. And during these projects, as I recruit performers, and these were all local performers, it's interesting to ask people to revisit the place where they live and to become scholars, to not take these places for granted, even though they think they know them so well, but to actually take a step back and move through them, research what they don't know of their own birthplace. This is, let me just show actually, water cycle. I go back and forth between performing alone and performing as a choreographer that may or may not perform with a group I put together. It depends on tons of factors. This was a solo project when the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston opened this beautiful building on the harbor. They had been downtown. They commissioned 4 artists to do 4 site-specific projects that first summer of their presence in the water. And it was an interesting building. It is an interesting building that faces the harbor and kind of gives its back to the city of Boston. There it is, the butt. And it's a hard one. And all the windows are facing that way. Nothing looks at the city of Boston. In fact, that glass you see down there is just utility rooms and so on. So, and it's like being in a ship or in some kind of underground submarine with rooms that kind of fall, for some of you who have been there, I'm sure, that seem to fall into the water. And so Massachusetts, Boston, a place enamored of its own Victorian past that is constantly staging historical reenactments of the Civil War, of the Victorian era. There was a lot of material there, and I'm always trying to push the medium. I mean, I'm always seeking training in performance art, in the performing arts. I like everything, all these traditions and exploring, and there's no particular formula other than the mixing of them and to different degrees. And so I looked at the harbor. The harbor in Boston is a place that is very busy with tourists, and the harbor has 34 islands, some of which are inhabited, some of which are historical, some of which are parks. I made some glass bottles in the shape of some of those islands. I made a kind of barrel, a kind of water sculpture based on what a sailor in the 18th century would have to carry his own water. And I devised this kind of persona that appeared in the gallery very early in the morning, kind of almost coming out of a wall, and activated himself, walked down the stairs out into the light, and began to walk the harbor and towards the city of Boston. There's this kind of a space, at least there used to be a few years ago, between the city and this new structure. and meeting people along the way and being followed by people along the way, and then eventually taking a ferry with people and arriving to one of 5 islands that we selected, and walking the perimeter of that island, trying to understand it with the body, and then gathering water, and walking back with that water to the museum, to the institute, I should say, and depositing the bottle there, neither as a scientist nor as a holy relic, but as someone who simply went out to get water. And then again, for 5 islands, this was George's Island, which has a huge colonial fort, and I wanted to understand that structure, a very heavy structure, totally out of place on such a small island in the middle of the harbor, but defending the harbor at some point. And I walked around it, this massive structure, just touching it, for hours, just understanding it with my walk and my hand. Children are wonderful. They're never afraid of you. It's very rare. There is the occasional one, but the adults were terrified of me. Many people thought I was a mime, and I accepted that. I had engaged in that language to some degree and tried to offer me dollars, stop me, and have their picture taken with me. I can be ruthless about it, I have to say. When you create a universe, you have to live by the rules of that universe, even though all rules have exceptions. And so most of the time, I kept that silence. And of course, I had a bloody hand after that. You scrape stone for hours. And so I was not entertaining. I was not there to entertain anybody. I was there to understand a waterfront and a harbor and its islands and the Atlantic, and how you can be in downtown Boston and not know that the Atlantic raging, that can kill you or sustain you with food is there. That kind of urban thing that happens in Manhattan. We're an island. Yeah, really. Are we an island? You would never guess, depending on where you stand. And so this was one of the farthest most islands in the harbor, which is operated by the Navy. It has a functional lighthouse. It has an island steward who receives you in 18th century garb. And I asked her if she would have tea with me, if she would host me and my followers and have a silent tea, 18th century tea, and she did. She was wonderful. She actually has a PhD in American history, and it's all very serious. And so she gave me a silent tour, imagining a silent tour of an island that normally is as talkative as hell, where everything is explained. And so she basically gave me a tour, and she had to find a language through which to convey the island for us, for me and several hundred people. And it became one of, indeed, pausing, pointing, touching, yet again, and so on. And then she walked me to the water, where I watched by a lot of birds, gathered water, and then the U.S. Navy ferry came for us and found us very peculiar. And then the island, which was picture perfect. It was, you would think that Walt Disney built the island, disappeared in the fog. And then the last thing, and I'm not sure how we're doing for time. Are we? Okay, great. The last thing is, I like placing the body at the service of whatever, though whatever can be dangerous. But and so the Spencer Museum in Kansas, and I worked a lot in Kansas. I'm fascinated, and I really mean it well without any condescension, by the Midwest, by the country. you know, the space between the coasts, the majority of our people. And so the University of Kansas invited me to do a piece about and by the Spencer Museum, which is kind of a mini metropolitan museum in the middle of the prairie. It's really quite remarkable and funny. And so the notion of bringing high culture, meaning Western, white European culture, to the prairie. And so I came in, and they have a wonderful program in the visual and the fine arts, training artists. So I came in barefoot and with a set of pencils and with a kind of uniform to the museum, which is heavily guarded by an incredible bureaucracy, as all museums are. And so I had the guards perform with me. They keep a very tight fist on this jewel of this museum, quite unique for the region. And so I had them be the gatekeepers. I revealed them as the gatekeepers that normally are behind things and really only appear to scold you very often. But so they gave me kind of this set of tools and allowed me in a kind of ceremony that was wonderfully serious. It was not a caricature of anybody or anything. And then here we are in the historical galleries. And what I did for the next 10 hours was draw everything I saw. I went around and I drew everything that was on view. So I basically created a catalog of what was on view in the building in that day, that moment in time, using recycled memos from the life of the institution that had been gathered for a year. So there was a pile of memos for me in each gallery, recycled paper. I would enter the gallery, pick up the paper, go and just begin to draw everything that I saw. And of course, I drew it performatively. You know, how could I not? I was not taking pictures through drawing. I was responding as you would to anything you see, and you zero in on the color red or on a gesture or on the fly in the soup, and then I would leave it in front of it. And it was interesting because my performances tend to be very quiet, and by the end, by an hour or two, it was incredible how people were looking at the collection, not following me so much as looking at what I was looking over my shoulder, looking at what I left behind. They would enter a gallery and ignore the collection and see the collection on the floor, and then have this discussion about what I saw versus what they saw versus what somebody else saw, and why did I see that? You know, why did I pick that detail? And so it was wonderful. It was wonderful to place the performer body, you know, in such a utilitarian tool-like way, and to fail, you know, as you see, to begin to draw something and say, no, this is wrong. This is not what I want to see, or you know, and then to, you know, destroy it and start again. So it was a wonderful experiment. Are we at the hour? Or do we have another minute? Not a trick question.
No, that's fine.
Okay, I'll show one more thing, just because you mentioned it. I'm going to speak next week about this project, so I don't want to say too much in a conference that happens next week on gender and landscape. But I was invited to be the first visiting artist at the College of Fine Arts of the University of Utah with Adobe software money that it received a $1 million endowment. And I did a piece. I spent about 2 years or 3 studying the history of the crossing of the plains, the settlement of Utah, the Utah territories, the desire to turn it into a country at one point, the Mormon contract, Mormon theology, and we did a piece called Awaiting about gender on the landscape. It was a piece with 100 participants, 40 performers, out of which 30 were women. And we basically spent the night from from sunset to sunrise, climbing the stairs of the Capitol, which is a replica of the Capitol in Washington. So very, again, this kind of emblematic architecture that wants to be like some other place, and doesn't quite embrace this one completely. And so this building completely out of proportion to the valley, crowning one of the few hills in the valley. We spent the night ascending and descending it, kind of like turning into a Jacob's ladder, braving the winds that came down from the snowy peaks that night, and then walking away by day. And it was fascinating. We had a town hall afterwards, mostly attended by women, and we talked about notions of waiting for Jesus to come back, waiting for abundance, the agency in waiting, the passivity in waiting, waiting for your husband in Mormon theology to die and call you by your secret name that you receive at your wedding and allow you to enter heaven. All these theologies that design gender and landscape. And I'll stop here. Thank you. So I'd love to, we can turn on lights if you wish and speak, and I'd love to converse. I'm going to close this.
Too bright.
Yes.
Do you use music in any of your work?
So far, no. Well, that's not true. Yes, in one work. I've begun to use the voice. In a piece that I did not show, but we did in Kansas, Farmer's Dream. We for the first time had a script. There's a poet called Lori Bragg. She's one of Kansas' best contemporary poets. Not very well known outside the region, nevertheless. And she had found the journal that her grandfather kept as a farmer in 1905 through the Great Depression. And from that, she turned it into a poetic script. And throughout the night, as we performed all night, the life of a family on the prairie as a kind of Midsummer Night's Dream, and so on, she read from it. But it was spontaneous, uneven, it came and went. She would look at us, be triggered emotionally by something, and respond to it by reading from the script. For the Mormon piece, we had, because we sometimes need to mark time when you throw the body onto such a vast area under the sky for 12 hours, how do you keep some vague sense of time other than moon and stars and sunrise, right? To help the body along. And so we had a former Mormon missionary woman tape different hymns, but they were abstracted. They were not literal. We kind of took words, phrases, sounds, humming. And so throughout the hill at night, every half hour during 12 hours, sometimes you would hear this humming, almost like the wind that came. So I've used music, and I've begun to use music. I'm interested in using more. I'm planning a performance where I sing for the first time. But it's been as a kind, not as music per se, but a sound that marks time, rather than a soundtrack that we dance or move to. That, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on ethics and purity?
Yeah. Well, very broad question. I mean, I'll answer very broadly, and then you made me more specific, right? So ask me again. When you work with people, they're not raw material, they're you and I, and so you have to be impeccably ethical. When you do pieces about people, you not only do you not want to be a tourist, you also don't want to be condescending, snobbish, superior, cynical. You want to place yourself, you want to be in their bones, and more than in their shoes. And so there are ethics to this kind of social portraiture, and it makes you have to be very selfless, It makes you have to put aside a lot of things. I mean, I'm not there to march in, and be an urban artist or be a gay artist or be whatever kind of artist. I'm there to put a series of tools I have at the service of something that will be critical. That there's no question that, when I did the Mormon piece, I don't know if they want to invite me back to do anything, because it really made a lot of women say during the town hall meeting that followed, I am sick of waiting. I am sick of waiting in my religion, and I'm sick of waiting in my marriage, and I'm sick of waiting, in lots of places in this social, fantasy we have built here. And so there are tons of ethics to face. Purity, I did a number of projects in Cuba. I was born there, and at one point I went back to both seek my roots as an American, as a Cuban American, and also to, as a fascinating country that I wanted to learn about. And I was accused by the Miami Herald and a bunch of folks of being a communist and this and that, and that my very presence there established a complicity between me and the lack of human rights in that political system, blah, blah, blah. And it was fascinating, I didn't know I was so powerful. Number one. Number two, I don't have any qualms about getting muddy. And I also find it objectionable that any kind of conflict should only be resolved by two white men, in power. And women and gays and artists are supposed to stand by and watch, because we are not adequate or, knowledgeable enough, or and so on. So I think that when I speak about purity, I don't mean aesthetics, and I don't mean spirituality, and so on. I simply mean that I, have a hard time with the notion of a pure space that cannot be tread upon, because you will violate it or contaminate it, or it will contaminate you. Working with, I'm going to be very cartoonish, but fat Republican ranchers in Kansas is going to somehow make me less of a progressive whatever being I'm supposed to be. So I'm really interested in audience and space, and not as a conqueror invader, but as an artist citizen, So does that kind of answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
I was wondering, you had pieces like the piece in the harbor and in Boston, and then the piece with the Mormon in Utah and all of that. One seems to be less driven for, I guess, like political measures or like politics, not necessarily like world politics, whatever. But what is there a shift in your perspective that creates the focus on like a silence or observation or documentation rather than some sort of argument, I guess?
You know, again, people teach me how to work with people, and landscapes teach me how to work with them. And I have a bit of a template. I have a training in slowness and in silence. And like Bonnie said very kindly, I believe that there's no space for reflection, meditation, decision-making. How can we make decisions about our lives as Americans when every waking moment is filled with clutter and speed and sound, you know? And so I, for one, believe that we need to carve out a kind of productive, creative solitude and silence to make some decisions about our lives and collectivity. So I have, you know, these notions, and I also seek something that cannot be consumed, that can only be experienced, like the moon in the sky, the full moon that you see, you know, late at night, in the middle of the night, very early in the morning. You can only experience it. You cannot buy it, put it in your pocket, you know, that kind of thing. So, and yet I may produce photographs and videos. And so, but they're not the experience. They're a shadow of the experience, a record, artistic or factual. So this is kind of a preamble to say that each project demands different things. And I do as much research as I can. The ethics of a project like these require tons of research, history, and so on. And then I get there, but I get there in a moment of vulnerability, nakedness, so that I have not planned the outcome. You know, I may have an intuition, and I trust my intuitions by now. I may have an instinct like an animal. In fact, I want to be an animal on that ground, a holy animal on that ground, you know, through sanctity, the holy animal. But I don't go there, you know, really with a very detailed, totally planned out secret agenda, like the Mormon Project, where I looked at different sites. I was looking for height. I was looking for emblematic architecture. I was struck by waiting as one of many cultural characteristics, one of many, but a very particular one. And then the project was taken over by women. That was not my doing at all. Suddenly, women flocked into the project. Mormon women, ex-Mormon women, and Gentile women, meaning women who have not even been a Mormon. So it was taken over by them. And the same in Hawaii. I arrived to Hawaii, and I had a notion of walking the city, of being in many places, of giving a map. And then the native indigenous community, and the Contemporary Art Museum, which recruited me, was a very white institution, very upper class, very much endowed by the great-great-grandchildren of missionaries and sugar planters. And yet, somehow, through the back door, all these native people came to my trainings and meetings and began to take over and say, no, these 12 places throughout the city of Honolulu, they're going to be these places. They're going to be these places that the tourists don't see, or that the tourists think they see, but see nothing. And so, and I have to have the wisdom and yet the stewardship, because I am in authority, hopefully a benign authority, to allow things to happen, while also, you know, training people and making art, all sorts of things. So there is a permeability that that allows itself to be informed by the place, site specificity, you know, in the truest sense, I'd like to think. Yeah. Bonnie.
I was just thinking maybe you could talk about how these pieces come about, what the whole logistics is. Do you get an idea for a piece and then try to find funding? Do you apply for funding and then the piece grows out of whatever the different geographic place works? I mean, how does one work in this system where you're outside and you know, you're not in specific venues, but often outside? Yeah,
you know, I have to say, and this will be a terribly simplistic answer, that I get commissions. You know, I'm at a point where there's very few things I apply for. People, the grapevine, the internet, books, publications, somebody talking to you and saying, who do you recommend to them? So in the beginning of my career, and I started out as an installation artist, making stages for the body that was about to arrive, your body as a spectator, and I kind of made you perform in my stage, my installation, or bodies that had just left and left a residue. I went around knocking on many doors, museums, galleries, whatever was appropriate to knock on, you know, because our art world is funny. A lot of it is by invitation, by recommendation. Very few things you can actually apply for, it's quite a business in that sense, unlike any other. But by the time, so I made a name creating these installations over 10 years, and then I made a switch. Somebody said to me, you know, you're always creating these stages. When are you going to perform in one of them? And it was, you know, the question of fire, you know, it really set me on fire. It was so obvious. It gave me permission, and sometimes you need someone to give you permission to do the obvious. I'm one of those people. And so, and I apply it to my teaching. I'm always giving permission to my students to do what they think they shouldn't do or can't do. And so, so I set out to perform, but by then, again, my simplistic answer, I had established a kind of name recognition, and invitations kept coming, only I started switching them. My response to them was performative. And so now these projects that you've seen have been truly commissions from different museums and universities. I just received a commission from Crossing the Line, the Festival of Contemporary Dance and Performance Art from the French Institut Alliance Française that happens every fall. And they've just commissioned me out of the blue to do 2 pieces, or 1 piece in parts 1 and 2 that will open and close the festival like bookends, 12 hours one night, 12 hours one day, both very public here in New York. And so I'm currently forming a company here in New York, just for the life of the project. But long before that, the minute I get a commission, and 2 things happen to maybe answer your question more in a different way. I start the research that I've mentioned already a few times, and I create a production team, because none of this can be done by a single body. It requires a team, and each project requires a different team. And so I undo the typical curator artist, you know, dilemma or dynamic. And I bring in to the table with the curator, who may be very surprised at times, people that I think must be involved. to help with the process, because we're talking about the public sphere, and the public sphere is maybe public, but it's owned by a million invisible entities that are its gatekeepers and stakeholders. From the security systems that surveil us in the public sphere, to the guards that we actually see, to the people who use that space, and suddenly a performer using that space may get in their way. They're used to sitting there and walking there and having their lunch there. To the pigeons, you know, that, I mean, there's an ecology, there's an urban ecology, and that I don't want to disturb. I don't think pigeons are rats. You know, I like them. So these projects elicit a machinery, a kind of machinery of scholarship, of production, not unlike a play. And I sometimes have all the funding I need, and sometimes I have to go out and beat the bushes and turn over stones and get more funding, complement the funding, because often, more often than not, it's a lot more than they bargained for. And so they think, oh, okay, 12 performers, you know, they'll walk around such a place. But what about the fact that this is not an endurance piece, and they will need to take 1 million breaks during 12 hours, 40 performers? Where are they going to go to sit down, to stretch out, to have water? So what about a green room and a green room in the public sphere? And so you suddenly start having to dialogue with a nearby community center, a church, a YWCA or YMCA. It makes you into a kind of political activist, public advocate, community person, just because, every place, every city has residents, even in office buildings now. Wall Street is filled with people who live in those office buildings, and so every step you take will impact on someone. And so often we will do 1 million presentations in public libraries, in office buildings, to the people who will be impacted by 12 hours of performance in their midst. And so I started this journey as an introvert, as a very shy person. And yet the practice made me have to swallow my embarrassment, which I still feel, and go out and talk and humble myself and in countless ways, asking permission, asking for help, asking all sorts of things over it. Yeah.
Had a few questions actually.
Sure.
Okay, I'll just start with the first one. Are you a dancer?
No, though I've trained in dancing, but I would lie to you if I said I was a dancer, yeah, or an actor, or a juggler, or a magician. No, but I have. I'm a performance artist in the traditional sense of the word, that where performance comes out of sculpture, if you will, and out of a reaction against, well, I mean, Bonnie could give us the lecture on the history of performance art much better than I could, and so I won't embarrass myself trying to give it, but I'm a performance artist in the sense that it's a reduction of a many of gestures and a certain kind of language with a certain kind of tradition. And yet I have sought training in dance and acting and all sorts of things to complement it. How, I don't think that's, how can one not, especially this kind of work. Yeah.
how do you find performers for, like, the piece that you did in? Do you use local people? The piece you did in Tel Aviv, were they local citizens?
You know, there's no one way. It's all sorts of ways. Again, you know, I find them through museum membership. I find them through museum, the family of a museum, meaning all the artists that gather and form the life of a museum, universities, art schools. I'm yoga centers, acting schools, dance schools. I find them where I can find them. I find them during a lecture, and I say, oh, I'm going to do a piece for the French Institute, and I'm still recruiting. And I have an implicit trust that when you are doing something that lasts 12 hours, it's kind of a whale with a very deep stomach that I trust to swallow and chew and produce the right people.
So do you hold auditions, or do you find people?
No, I actually hold what I call a reading, which I already held one, and I'm about to hold a second. And you're welcome. I mean it. I held a reading to which 24 people from all sorts of places came, and basically I read them a proposal. I read a document, kind of like reading a dream. I say, you know, I've been invited to do this, and you know, and this is my vision for it. It's a very vulnerable, naked document where I talk about my strengths and my fears about what we are setting out to do. I talk about a training that is not about putting up a Broadway show or whatever, but I talk about a training that will engage in all sorts of things like silence and fasting and, you know, what a piece like that may require. So that the body, you know, knows it has everything it needs, but at the same time there's a discipline and a rigor to that body. And so I hold a reading, and already the reading scares half the people away, and because I hold a very intense reading, and it's like a performance. I perform my dream, my performance, and then the people who stay are the people who are as mad as me and want to do this thing that is unexplainable and kind of intangible at the moment, and then I do a second reading because, you know, it takes a few.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know. It's casting calls. I prefer to fire someone later and embrace them at first. I take that risk most of the time, unless it's so obvious that I should not invite them. But I prefer when somebody says, when they see this and they come to a reading and they talk to other people in the room and they say, I'd like to do this. At that point, I trust, you know, and I trust the process. And the process will take about 6 months. So that kind of commitment, so, you know, there's the process has its own wisdom in a certain way. Yeah.
My other question was about the museum drawings that you did, and you said, like, there were some things that you wanted to see, some things that you didn't want to. I didn't want to see that. You threw it away. What were those things? Could you just say more about?
Oh, well, you know, the way that you stand in front of a painting and you think you're going to see, like, the portrait of, you know, 16th century portrait, and you think you're going to see the face. And suddenly in that moment, in that performative moment, you find yourself seeing a little finger that holds a ring and that is, you know, almost breaking with the hand, the rest of the hand, and that's what you see, and that's what you draw. and or not, or you refuse it. And so sometimes I would refuse it, sometimes I would embrace it and just allow my body, my gaze to do that. And so, it was a very interesting experiment for me in perception, for me, and then for everyone else that really got into it. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
And they kept the drawings. They, at the end of the day, I walked away, and then everything stayed there overnight. And then the next day we came and we picked them up in order, and the museum got a catalog of its own works. And it has it. Yeah.
I have another question, but I don't want to hog the microphone if anyone else wants to. Okay. I'm just curious about your religious practices and your spiritual practices.
I don't have religious practices. I'm going to kind of grab that word. People say, well, I would say that spirituality for me is anything imbued with the human spirit. The human spirit that doesn't want to die. That's the human spirit. It doesn't want to die. It doesn't want to end. It wants to live forever and live fully, meaningfully. That is spirituality. Anything that is imbued, filled with that. So this is a very spiritual moment in that sense. Your questions, my answers, her presentation, your silence, very generous, your silence, listening, and so on. This is what I talk about when I say spirituality. That's the work. I was a Trappist monk for a number of years. It was a very amazing formation. I also, at some point, began to practice Zen Buddhism, which I enjoy as a kind of form and language. But it is very personal, and I have written about it, but most of the time I prefer for it to remain as bones in me, rather than as words from me. And so it is part of the structure that comes to a place, that those experiences, those practices. But ultimately what's coming to the place is this notion of spirituality that is very humanistic and secular. And that understands that one doesn't need to talk about religion to talk about transcendence and transformation. Everybody seeks that. Everybody.
Were you raised in a certain religion?
Yes, I was raised a very good little Roman Catholic with 12 years of, sisters and fathers, 12 years of private Catholic school. Yes, thank you very much. And then 1 year of theology. Well, I studied art and all that. So I did, graduate, undergraduate. I studied psychology. I studied a lot of things. I'm very checkered. But I spent 1 year studying theology at a seminary surrounded by men who wanted to be priests, something I did not want to be. But I was the milieu that I had to access in order to study theology, Western Christian theology, which I was very interested in, and then 4 years as a Trappist monk, and then 2 years as a member of the Catholic Worker, which is was founded by Dorothy Day and Peter Moore and the French anarchists during the Great Depression, and as houses for the homeless men and women, and living with and among the homeless. And I did that for 2 years. It was great. It was I write about it in a book I published last year, I think. I write about it, The Body of the City. And it was quite a formation also in performance to experience the homeless body and so on, yeah. So I'm interested in religion as cultural material. You know, I separate religion as, you know, as a kind of cultural material that I think is, again, there for the taking, and we make the mistake of not using it, I think. It's there like any mask or any piece of architecture, you know. Religion is a kind of architecture, more intangible perhaps, more immaterial, but I think it's also there for the artist to take. That is different from religious art. Yeah, so should we say thank you and good night?
Thank you.
Thank you and good night. Thank you.